date is June 2009, and our venture will take us up the Columbia Gorge on I-84, past Multnomah Falls, then into Idaho and on to Wyoming. We'll do the whole 850 miles all in one day. It's early in the morning, and the early morning clouds are yet to burn off as we head up the Columbia Gorge. Our two grandsons, Joe and Dustin, are with us on this trip. Our trip will take us up the Columbia Gorge and then up over the top into Idaho and clear through Idaho on to Wyoming. We go past dams, rivers, cities, and junkyards on our way to Wyoming. We'll pass thousands of wind generators, all up through the gorge and even out into Idaho in certain places. Over Cabbage Hill, looking back at Pendleton, Oregon, nestled in a little coulee right in the edge of the Blue Mountains. Majestically, the sun sets over the flat plains of Idaho as we continue pushing eastward through more than half of the night. We'll continue on. We reach the cabin about 1 o'clock the next morning, and it's time to get up shortly after daylight. There's work needs to be done around the cabin. That night, Mother Nature furnished us a spectacular sunset. We go to bed at good time, only to get up early the next morning to continue on our adventures. There's frost on the car. This is past mid-June, but it's still frosting at 7,600 feet. But the sun's coming up nice and bright, and we're loading up the gear we'll need. We're heading for the Red Desert today. 2 hours later, we arrive at the Red Desert to find the roads are still somewhat muddy, but it's supposed to be a nice day, and it doesn't take long for them to dry up out here. The first stop is a prairie dog town. Joe wants to get him a prairie dog to mount.
Aim high.
Okay, shoot careful now. There's one sitting on top of a hill over there. He just moved a little, but he's still there.
Somebody hit to the left of him.
That was me.
How much is yours dropping, Dustin?
Only a footer.
Only a foot.
Only a foot. Oh, okay.
I see 3 of them standing up over on the other place. Oh, there's one big fat one standing there. There he's standing up straighter.
Shot after shot pierced the early morning air of the red desert, and the prairie dogs don't seem to be in any particular trouble with these 2 boys shooting at them.
Ah, I see.
Where were you hitting?
Low. Did you get him?
No. He just went behind a little bush there. Just the tip of his... There, he stuck his head down.
Do they all pop back in the holes?
A lot of times they do. You don't feel him, huh?
An evening primrose is in full bloom. Desert cattle are bedded down right in the edge of the road. The famous landmark is now in view, the boar's tusk. This was used by early pioneers for navigation. It's a one-of-a-kind rock right out in the middle of red desert. Out of nowhere, some horses come galloping up and come right up to us. These must not be wild horses. Maybe with the poor economy, someone couldn't afford to care for them, or else maybe they belonged to a nearby ranch, but they came up close enough and insisted on being petted. They're in a really pretty place here with the boar's tusk in the background, but I think these horses would just as soon have came home with us. They probably would like a couple oats to eat. A few antelope stand and watch us and then take to hoof and gallop off through the desert. A nice buck stands in the sagebrush just watching. They brag to be the world's fastest long-distance runners. There are several animals that can run faster than they at a short distance, but for the long haul, these are the fastest. They're not a true antelope because they lose the sheath off their horns every year, and their horns fork, so they're a species all their own. A trip to the Red Desert wouldn't be complete without a trip to the petroglyph site at White Mountain. These cliffs were used by early man for art purposes, and even an eagle's nest sits high on the cliff above the petroglyph site. There are numerous animals carved in the rock. There's a bear that has a baby inside it. And as we move along, the entire cliff wall has different petroglyphs carved deeply into the stone. It looks as though this person carved in the stone was having a good time. They're big elk with massive antlers, and there are several caves here with the interior of the cave lined with petroglyphs. Dustin and Joe go in the cave and look on the walls and ceiling and see all sorts of petroglyphs. They're petroglyphs of women, as in this case. The humanoids seem to be in a ceremonial position, carved on the sides and roof of the sandstone cave. Many humanoids are preserved in stone inside the cave, where probably the elements won't erode them very fast. Some of the petroglyphs were quite well done, and others were more or less just stick figures, but all of them complete. Lots of bears, and even in some of the later ones we see horses represented on the sandstone walls of White Mountain. There's even the ancient stains left by the smokes at campfires on the ceilings of some of the caves. And in this particular cave we notice a horse, so this more or less dates this site. When these were first started here, there were probably horses hadn't came to the Americas yet. The boys go on in the cave and check it out. It seems like it would be pretty comfortable on a hot day, or it would be a good place to withstand a storm with those chilly breezes. From the cave, it gives us a pretty good view of the hearth area right outside the cave. That was probably used for all types of human things like ceremonies and dances. I'm not sure what this animal is. We saw a few of them. It may be a bear, and they've forgotten put too long a tail on him. A buffalo, a very definite buffalo, is carved into the stone, and it looks as though a couple teepees. Then we go around the corner, and there are numerous handprints carved real deep in the sandstone. We think this was a birthing area, and the women would put their hands in there and scratch to withstand the pain of labor. There are dozens of handprints in different areas. Just across from the handprints, there is a woolly mammoth scratched into the cliff walls, and bear tracks above. And those are not just an ordinary bear, they're grizzly bear tracks. Many other things that we don't know what they are. A buffalo, most definitely, right in front of us. And a big elk. A hunter posing with his bow and arrow. More bear tracks carved into the stone. As we walk along, we see many more human handprints by nature's bonsai tree. A horse. There's even a buffalo with a hole carved in it. Maybe someone shot this buffalo, and a really tall stick figure person standing above all the petroglyphs. The symbol of water right above the buffalo. Then we find another cave. Dustin goes in to check it out and finds there's the typical smoke stains on the ceiling of the cave right above us. There are even footholds carved into the stone so you can climb up and get to the cave. It's up about 15 feet above the desert floor. Some flowers are blooming right around the edge of the petroglyph site. From White Mountain, we head back out into the desert and find another prairie dog town. These boys are going to get a prairie dog or know the reason why. Dustin shot one and reached down in the hole, and he has a prairie dog finally. A hawk sits on his perch on the top of a sagebrush, right on top of a desert hill. It looks to be the red-tailed hawk, and he'll sit there for a bit and watch us, and then take to wing out across the red desert to finish hunting for his dinner around the prairie dog town. Joe checks out a large ant hill made of tiny stones they've gathered and piled them up. We find another cliff where we understand there's supposed to be petroglyphs, so we're going to check it out. We see numerous caves all over the cliff walls. We find none of the caves with smoke stains on the wall though, so we're not in the right area to find petroglyphs, but it was quite interesting checking out the caves. Looks like they deserved well for a cave shelter for Stone Age man, but there's so many of them they couldn't have used them all. The boys go in to get out of the direct sunlight. We look up above us and find another cave up here, and some rock rabbits are calling it home. We can see a big nest in it. Then we look out across the desert and see a herd of wild horses. There's even a white one in the bunch and a colt. They look to be some real pretty horses, some nice big mares, and of course a big stallion following up in the rear. They're a little bit restless, but just the same, they're grazing their way across in front of us, with the big stallion taking up the rear a few yards behind. And there he is, and he's one huge old stallion. He'll always stay between you and the mares and colts. He's a big enough, tough enough looking stallion that I doubt that any other stallion's going to want to steal his mares and colts. They're quite nervous and quite interested in us, so they won't stick around too long. They'll take off. But the little colt, he sees the opportunity to play as the big stallion follows on the left rear. We move up to a site where we see a little road go up and in. We thought maybe this is the petroglyph site, so we get out and look. There are a few pine trees with some pine cones on them. They call this Pine Canyon. And then on the rocks we see no petroglyphs, but we see all sorts of initials and dates and brands. The brands and dates, some of them were back, about the latest ones we could see were like the 1950s, and they're carved all over the sandstone. Then we notice a wire with a bunch of tin cans hanging on it. The rocks could be put in, so they rattle a lot. And then a fence above. This box canyon had a spot where there was a fence because we think they captured wild horses here. At one time, if you caught a wild horse, it was yours. And so they'd run them up in this box canyon and capture them. There was even a pole fence and a heavy wire fence hooked to some of the juniper and pine trees along the edge of this box canyon. We get up higher to look to see what's on the other side. We see nothing of interest on the other side, so we've decided this was a horse catching place. There's even some of the old juniper fence posts still standing where they were used to keep the horses from escaping, and more brands and dates are carved into the stone by ranchers. The ranch brands, there were numerous ranch brands on the stones, and then down below is an old loading dock where apparently they'd back an old truck up and load the captured horses on the truck, and we look at the ground and see there's still horses running free here, so they surely didn't get 'em all. A stallion pile on the road, and then a prairie dog town, and there's a prairie dog sitting alongside his hole. Ranchers no longer capture wild horses. That's become illegal. The boys still have a little ammunition left, and they're going to test it out on some prairie dogs and see if that modern ammunition is any good.
Got him.
I think the scope's off.
Jeez. There's 3 of them popped up to the left. You got him.
At least got 2 because I.
Two old wild stallions slowly make their way across a hilltop in front of us, gently waving their tail to keep mosquitoes and flies at bay. They sure have long manes and tails, that they're out here every day of the year, and they withstand the cold and the blizzards of winter. When it gets really snowy and cold, they just take those powerful hooves and dig the grass up from below the snow. We go on to the spot which is called the Tri-Territorial Monument. This was a very important historical site in the building of our nation.
Tri-Territory Historic Site, marking the common boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, 1809, the Northwest Territory, 1846, and Mexico, 1848. The site is located where the Continental Divide crosses the 42nd parallel north latitude, dedicated September 24th, 1967.
A wild stallion stands at attention as we move on by and then goes to grazing. The boys are now ready to test their aim again as we pass by a prairie dog town.
What?
Way out there.
From the prairie dog town, we go to Freighter's Gap to take a look at the millions and millions of fossils left by the Great Basin. These are marine type fossils, snails and clams and stuff like this. A trip to the Red Desert is never complete without checking out these magnificent old bull elk. There's a herd of 7 of them here again, and they're not small elk either. Although their antlers aren't totally developed, almost, they're still in what's called the velvet stage. After shedding their antlers earlier in the year, they grow new ones each year. The elk are in their natural environment here. They were only chased up into the timber when settlers came, but they're plains animals where they like to be. They line out and walk over a distant hill. They're getting just a little bit nervous of us being there, but not really too bad. They're bulls of several different sizes, all of them magnificent animals with those giant antlers that they'll polish up. By fall, all the velvet will be rubbed off, and these antlers will be polished to where they shine on the sagebrush. They're all friends now, but when those antlers get polished and hard in the fall, rutting season comes and they'll be bitter enemies by that time. We're fortunate enough to find a good-sized flock of the sage grouse. Some of them should be still nesting and should have young, but we've seen no young so far. They're our largest grouse, and I think they're a symbol of the wide open prairies, and Wyoming is where they belong. And what a great bird they really are. They're not great flyers, and the cowboys of old used to run them down on horseback. A good-sized buck antelope sneaks away through the sagebrush ahead of us. This buck has a quite respectable, nice set of horns on top his head. It's getting close to evening, but the sunshine of today has dried these mud roads out to where they're pretty good. There's some deep ruts in them from being a lot of rain this year, and this place can get so muddy you can't even get through some of the roads after a good rainstorm. Back at the cabin, an old buck antelope tries to sneak in next to our car. He likes it in here, and we get a picture of him right out the window of the cabin the next morning. The boys were pretty played out after the all-day trip out to the Red Desert. It was after dark when we got in last night, so we'll just do a short trip today and look at the antelope around the cabin.
Kendall Warm Springs Dowse. This is the only stream in the world where the dowse is found. These fish developed into a distinct species when travertine deposits, which formed the waterfalls, isolated them from the river. The largest fish grow to be 2 inches long during spawning.
This warm springs can no longer be used for bathing or soaking. At one time it was quite a popular place, and people were going up here bathing and soaking and washing their clothes in the hot springs, even using soap, and this was destroying these tiny little endangered species dowse. A few wild flowers like the warmth of the hot springs and grow around the edge of the hot springs, as these monkey flowers are growing right on the edge of the warm springs bank, with the tiny little dowse going to and fro right in the water in front of them. It appeared as though there were good numbers of these tiny little fish, where a large one only reaches the length of about 2 inches. There's a very nice assortment of wild flowers growing on the warm ground all around the little warm springs. Even the elk thistle is growing well here, and the little elephant heads are growing, as well as other little violets and this sticky geranium. There's a good flow down the little hot springs, and then it falls down a travertine waterfall and dumps into the Green River. And this waterfall's what's isolated the tiny little dows so they can no longer get into the Green River. There are numerous wildflowers as we move on up the Green River. We see something sneaking through the brush not far from the Green River as we head toward the Green River Lakes, and we notice it. It's a real scroungy looking little fox, and he's sure a sneaky little guy. We arrive at the Green River Lake just as a nasty little thunderstorm is rolling in, so we won't have much time. There's a few people and dogs down on the lake. The boys will take a few pictures, and we'll make certain we get one of Flat Top. A few strawberries are blooming on the shores of the Green River Lake. The waves are coming in, slopping against the shore. There's a bird nest. We have no time to see what it is. And the Green River winds its way down the Green River Canyon. It has a lot of nice meadows along the edge, which are excellent habitat for a lot of the grazing wildlife. A mule deer doe is grazing away. Then she sneaks up into the trees and makes herself real scarce. Someone had seen a grizzly bear up around Green River Lake that very morning, but we weren't that lucky. We noticed antelope most everywhere, and this is a little bachelor herd of all bucks, as they're going to take the hoof and run off into the sagebrush. It looks like they're feeling good due to the rain and doing some really fast running. We still haven't finished mowing all the grass around the cabin, so Joe's going to take care of some of that right now, and so we'll do what we can. We find a puffball growing in the backyard. This is probably an edible type mushroom, but we chose not to eat it. They're just too pretty to eat. As Joe moves his way around the cabin, mowing the grass. We're trying to get as much done as possible today, because tomorrow we're thinking of going to Yellowstone, and it sure sounds like a good idea to me.
When we got ready to leave to go to Yellowstone Park, we went outside, and in front of the cabin was a big buck antelope. Everyone watches out the window to take a look at the antelope outside of our window. Everyone is anxious to go to Yellowstone Park, so they're getting their stuff ready and packing up. Joe is coming down from the upstairs and walking out to go to Yellowstone Park. Tom is starting the car, and we're on our way. We're pulling out around the cabin now, and we're on our way. We're on our way now, heading towards Yellowstone Park, with black clouds above us as we go. Cross the Green River and north to Yellowstone. We're on our way.
Our nation's flag gently waves in the breeze under cloudy skies as we reach the town of Jackson. Past the famous antler arches as we head north toward Yellowstone. We make the turn, and there's not even very many tourists around this morning. I guess we're a little earlier than most of them. Only minutes from Jackson, we can see our first glimpse of the Teton Mountains standing high and tall in a bank of clouds. As we move northward, we see the fog is gently lifting above the Teton mountain range with some balsa root flowers in the foreground. As we push farther up along the Teton mountain range, we come to Jackson Lake. A few tourists from all over the world are here, enjoying this spectacular view. Everyone has their cameras and they're taking plenty of pictures as we move through the pay station. We've reached Yellowstone National Park now as the clouds are beginning to lift and a little sunshine is beginning to peek through the clouds. We pull up to the pay station and I want to find out where those grizzly bears are. I've heard there's a valley where they are this time of year, and so I'm going to ask the park ranger.
There you go.
Oh, thank you. Do you know, there's supposed to be a valley up here where there are grizzly bears. Are they still around?
There are bears throughout the entire park.
Oh, you don't know where there's a more likely spot?
There's all throughout the different parts of the park.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, thanks.
That's the beach getting mosquitoes out.
Just because he's a park ranger working in Yellowstone doesn't mean he's got any ambition or enthusiasm for his job. It was just give us a quick answer as quick as he could and get us out of there. Besides, it's time for the break. And he couldn't care less about grizzly bears and probably doesn't even know himself. You have to have done a little research to find out about them. We reach the Continental Divide, and Marge always loves to stop at the Continental Divide and take some pictures. From here, she'll drive a little while as we move deeper and deeper in Yellowstone toward Old Faithful.
You darn kids better behave or Marge is gonna whip. We'll have our picnic in the car.
That way yogi kids do.
Just so Grizz doesn't get it.
And we made it, finally, to the parking lot at Old Faithful Lodge. We move our way through the parking lot and out to the benches where people from all over the world sit and watch Old Faithful go off. This is a routine. People sit there and watch and wait every hour of every day for this spectacular sight of this geyser called Old Faithful. Old Faithful just sat and steamed for a long time, puffing out a little bit of hot water and steam to where we were wondering if it were ever going to go off, and many of the tourists were getting anxious. And then finally, to the delight of all, it started doing a little bit of pre-eruption. Many of these people came from afar to see this erupt, and so they were more than pleased to see it happening. And there were all sorts of comments. People were awestruck at the power and the might of this geyser.
Wow. What do you think of that, Becca? Ta-da! Look at that. Wow.
I'm gonna make it disappear.
The show was totally spectacular, and I heard all sorts of comments from people. Hardly words can describe it. But now it is winding down and will soon be over. Dustin is one of totally thousands of cameras that are here to get their own version of Old Faithful erupting. After Old Faithful was done, we took a hike around to see if we could find some more of those super hot springs and all the show that Yellowstone had to provide for us. Right here in Old Faithful Geyser Basin, all sorts of bubbling mud pots and boiling hot springs, and even some American avocet are sitting here resting. From a park ranger, we learned there was another geyser getting ready to erupt, and the name of this geyser is Beehive Geyser, and it's even taller than Old Faithful, so we're going to stick around and watch it, as many other people are, under partly cloudy sky. Beehive Geyser is described as a roaring and powerful geyser. It just sounds like a freight train when it goes off, and it only happens one time per day, and it's not really, you can't really tell just when.
So this is Beehive Geyser that's erupting right now. Beehive Geyser is one of our taller geysers, and it's not one that we can predict. It only erupts about once or twice a day. And we know it does give us about 5 to 20 minutes of warning when that little geyser right next to it starts erupting. Because that's an indicator that Beehive is getting ready to go, that little geyser is called Beehive's indicator. Beehive can hit heights of 150 feet or more, which makes it significantly taller than Old Faithful. It also lasts longer than Old Faithful does, and if it erupted as often as Old Faithful, it would probably be more famous.
Yeah, well, we're very fortunate to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's roaring and powerful, so let's just
oh, yeah, yeah.
Old Faithful is only one of many geysers, but Old Faithful is the one that's most faithful. It goes off about once every hour. It takes a little longer now. It's slowed up a little bit from what it used to be, but they're just geysers all through this geyser basin. I can only wonder at what the early explorers thought when they walked through here and saw all this bubbling water and the geysers. They probably had never seen or heard of anything like this before. There are all sorts of hot springs, superheated hot springs and pools, and more geysers. As we walk around the geyser trail, we can see boiling water coming out of the ground and sitting there boiling. There's even algae that lives in the hot springs. From this algae, they use this in the DNA testing because it's adapted to where it can withstand the superheat of hot springs. So it has proved to be very useful for modern science. There's more hot water shooting out of the ground every place we look. A lot of the sites, such as this one, aren't necessarily an eruption that happens every so often. It just happens all the time, as we continue around the boardwalk around Geyser Basin. We made the long hike around the entire Geyser Basin, seeing a chipmunk scamper and climb under the walkway. Castle Geyser is standing tall, waiting to erupt, but we didn't just know when, so we won't be able to see it. They're hot pools, boiling hot pools. It looks like you can see to the center of the earth in some of them, and others are just sitting there boiling. If we had something along, we could sure cook our food there, but in this place you're not supposed to put anything in the geysers, so that wouldn't be a good idea. We make our way around to the car, get in the car, drive up the road a little while, and there lays a large American bison. Whenever there's an animal, there's a group of cars stopped there, and these people are taking a little bit more chance than I think they should. That bison could hop to his feet, and they're very agile, great jumpers and runners, and he could, if he was in a bad mood, he could flip that kid skyward in the blink of an eye, and you wouldn't have a chance. As most animals, when they butt something with those great big hard heads, they'll flip it clear up over their back, and that's a ride I don't think I'd want to go on, so I'm not going over close to these big beasts that are shedding their winter coat for their summer coat, and they're just laying here sleeping. Some little monkey flowers are blooming along the path as we go past more and more geysers. We're taking a loop around to see a bunch more geysers. It's called Fire Lake. It's just one of thousands of displays of the gurgling hot water. Yellowstone has got to be the most fascinating place I've ever visited. Past a steaming hot lake with tons of steam evaporating and heading up into the clouds. We're going to start back now. We're heading back toward Old Faithful, and what a sight it's been seeing Yellowstone. There are tens of thousands of tourists visit Yellowstone every day during the summer months, and so there's lots and lots of people around, but you can't expect to have a place this spectacular all to yourself, so it's okay to share it with the rest of the world, I would say. And all the hot springs and geysers are real, so I would say Yellowstone is one of the greatest places on this earth. Even a few bison, it looks as though the bison bulls we saw on the way up have got up from their nap and decided to resume feeding right on some of the tender young grasses of Yellowstone National Park. The bison may have finished their nap, but it looks like we might have a pretty tired Yellowstone visitor in our back seat. It's going to take us about 2 hours to get to the cabin, so it looks like those boys are Yellowstoned out for the day. They never even woke to take a glimpse of the giant Yellowstone Lake up here on top of the world. We stopped briefly to take a look at the giant Teton Mountains in the background. The fog is finally burned off, and Marge wants to take some pictures of the spectacular Teton Mountains. A little marmot is grazing on some of the grass seeds and the grass down closer to Jackson. The Teton mountain range has got to be one of the most spectacular mountain ranges of the Rockies, as those peaks seem to pierce the sky itself. A little marmot is still feeding on some sweet clover right in front of his den. They have to get fat while everything's green, and then just as soon as everything starts drying up, they go into a complete hibernation. This is different than a bear's hibernation. They can't be awakened. From there, we run into a little lightning storm, and it's deposited hail thick as snow on the highway as we push our way toward the cabin. The next day, we decide to take a trip down to Daniel, Wyoming, and see the schoolhouse where my mom went to school. After that, I want to take a drive up Granite Creek. We're going to the hot springs, and this is one of my favorite spots of seeing wildflowers. There are all kinds of balsa root and lots of the sticky geraniums and some of the deadly larkspur right in front of us. Some tiny little phlox have their little propellers of flowers stuck up above the forest floor for pollination, and the sticky geraniums are growing all in the edge of the timber. We make a quick stop at Granite Waterfalls and watch the water tumbling down over the boulders of Granite Creek, with plenty of sticky geraniums in the foreground. Granite Hot Springs is nestled in between the peaks of the Grovont mountain range. There's a short trail you walk up to go to the hot springs, pay your fee, and then you can get in this really nice warm water of Granite Hot Springs, and the boys are going to swim till they get a sunburn and their hide almost all peel off. An old doe mule deer thinks she's camouflaged and doesn't even have to move as she stands next to a beaver dam with a large beaver house on the back side of the dam. Right on the edge of Granite Creek is another marmot trying to get fat, nibbling some of the weeds and grasses right in the edge of Granite Creek. He wants to get fat so he can hibernate as well. There's one thing we haven't done yet, and that's go out on top of the hills overlooking the Green River and see the spirit circles built by early Americans. The boys are more into keeping away from the mosquitoes than the spirit circles. You couldn't even open your mouth but what a mosquito would fly in. Then when we'd get in the vehicle, they had to swat mosquitoes for a while before we could go on. But we finally found the spirit circles on top of this hill. This one is a large arrow pointed right directly at one of the peaks of the Wind River mountain range. This arrow is over 60 feet long and was built here by Stone Age man, we think. Right on the end of the arrow is a pile of rocks, and I don't really know what they meant unless it's just an attempt at making the arrowhead, which it looks as if it might be. Then we find the spirit circles. Due to the large amount of grass that's growing up here, we didn't find them as easily as we do sometimes, but they are there. These rings of stone have had some very special meaning for early Americans, and we think they're a spot where they'd set at sunrise or sunset and do their worship ceremony. They were a very religious group of people. Then we get distracted. We found some mushrooms, and so we think a mushroom feed would be in order. Since there's been a lot of rain this year, maybe we can find us some really good mushrooms. When we drop down off the peak of the hill, we find some mushrooms like you've never seen mushrooms before. And these are all edible mushrooms. So we're going to have a feast. That is, several feasts. The boys are picking these giant mushrooms.
Okay. Now hold him up and let's see. Boy, he looks good. Let's get some more.
Yeah, I'll go put this one in.
After the mushrooms, the boys decided they wanted to go try their luck at another prairie dog.
He's gone. Better be.
Just under him, Joe.
What about that time?
You missed him. I didn't see where. He's still there. You shot just under him.
I get him?
I think he just went over him. Yeah, he's standing up again. Just under him. You shot over him. You shot just a little to the left and a little low. A little high.
That's pretty far.
Just a little low. Little high.
He went back down.
We find some wild crocuses putting their beautiful bloom, the first blooms of spring out. And we find our first cactus, prickly pear cactus in bloom, and another crocus. The boys are still in to hunting some. Time after time, they shoot the tiny caliber .22 rounds at the prairie dogs, usually missing most of the time.
You got one?
I just got one earlier.
There, you got another one.
They each have a prairie dog, so that ought to be plenty. We'll see if we can get him out of the hole. Sometimes they kick their way down into the hole and we can't find them. But it looks like this time maybe they're going. And Dustin's got his nice big prairie dog he wants to mount. Now it's time we have to start heading for home, even though the boys are not ready. An old doe antelope rushes away in front of us. We stop at Names Hill to see where Jim Bridger has carved his name into the sandstone walls at Names Hill. This was one of the popular places for crossing the Green River, and there it is, Jim Bridger's name carved
He little knew that
in the
when he cut his
sandstone
name into,
walls that named
or had it cut
him.
into stone, that it would be engraved in the annals of history of the West deeper than any other man. As one of the world's outstanding explorers, he guided immigrants, railroads, and armies into the expansion of a nation.
Our next stop will be Fossil Butte National Monument. This is the spot where they've recovered some of the finest fish fossils in the world, all from Fossil Lake, and they have a national monument here where you can see them. There was even an alligator found in the fossils, a paddlefish, a gar, and every other kind of fish that was around at that time that was trapped in Fossil Lake and died. There are insects, dragonflies, a snake, a bat, and birds of a lot of different types, all fossilized in stone right here in the National Park Museum at Fossil Butte. From there we go to Soda Springs. You dip this water out of the springs and it's naturally carbonated. We have some pre-sweetened Kool-Aid, and I preferred the grape, so we got grape. We pour it in the water, shake it a little bit, and then you can't tell it from soda pop. It's just like soda pop. Rather than buy soda pop, if these boys want to rot their teeth out, they've got to make their own, and that they've done. The town toughies used to tell me they'd come down here and dip this naturally carbonated water out of Soda Springs and mix it with alcohol and make themselves real good drinks. But these boys know better than to do that, so they're just having Kool-Aid in theirs.
Does it taste?
Not have it quite so full.
What does yours taste like, Joe?
No,
Tastes like grape soda.
Doesn't have enough seal water.
After loading up on soda pop, we take my mom to see her uncle's grave site at Lava Hot Springs. He was the one that told the story to Owens, and Owens wrote the book, The Virginian, about him.
Okay, now.
It's the grave of my Uncle Charlie Ball, better known as the Virginian, and he married my father's sister, Ellie Alexander.
Where did he meet her?
I don't know. He came.
At Medicine Bowl, didn't he?
What?
He met her at Medicine Bowl, didn't he?
Oh, probably did.
Yeah.
They were around Medicine Bowl there. She was
A school teacher, wasn't
yeah.
she? Yeah. Yeah.
He came from New York, I believe. Charlie Ball did. But I wonder who put the flowers out.
You say they had 3 boys and 3 girls?
Yeah.
And one of the boys, your folks were taking care of him, you said, and they forgot him?
Yeah, that was just a day, though. And
They went into town on wagons?
yeah, they went in to get groceries. Went home, forgot they had him.